The rain against the tall sash windows of the Kensington flat did not fall so much as it hammered, a relentless, rhythmic percussion that seemed to syncopate with the thrumming tension inside the room. Elias stood by the marble kitchen island, his fingers tracing the cold, veined surface. The air smelled of damp wool and the bitter, over-steeped dregs of an Earl Grey tea that had gone cold an hour ago. Across from him, Sarah was a study in rigid geometry, her shoulders squared, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested a fortress under siege. They had reached that particular stage of an argument where the initial subject of forgotten dinner reservation, a trivial lapse in communication, had long since evaporated, leaving behind a raw, caustic atmosphere of existential scrutiny. Elias, a man whose professional life was dedicated to the study of behavioral neurology, could feel the physiological shift within his own body. It was a familiar and welcome guest. His heart rate had climbed to a steady 90 beats per minute. His palms were beginning to prickle with a fine sheen of sweat, and there was a distinct tightening in his chest, a constriction of the intercostal muscles that made each breath feel shallow and insufficient. This was the autonomic nervous system in full revolt. The amygdala, that primitive, almond-shaped cluster deep within his temporal lobes, had detected a threat. It did not matter that the threat was not a predator in the tall grass, but rather the sharp, dismissive tone of the woman he loved. To his biology, the sting of her words was an arrow, and his system was preparing for a fight-or-flight response that was entirely disproportionate to a domestic dispute. But the silence stretched, heavy and metallic. Sarah's eyes remained hard, reflecting the cold light of the pendant lamp above. She was, Elias realized with a sinking sensation in his gut, currently trapped in a defensive loop. To her, at this moment, he was not her partner of 5 years. He was the opposition. He was the problem to be defeated, the obstacle to her sense of being right. This is the danger of high conflict moments. They act as a centrifuge, spinning the unified couple apart until they are two isolated entities, each convinced of their own martyrdom. In his mind, Elias replayed the words of the prompt he had once read about the neurology of love. A healthy relationship is not defined by the absence of conflict, but by the quality of it. It is about whether you use the argument to solve a problem, or if you turn your partner into the problem to be solved. He saw Sarah opening her mouth to speak, and he braced himself. He could feel the galvanic skin response, the subtle change in the electrical resistance of his skin, as he anticipated another blow. "You always do this," she said, her voice low and serrated. "You retreat into your intellectual ivory tower whenever things get uncomfortable. You think that because you can name the parts of the brain, you're somehow above the mess of actually feeling something." The accusation hit him with visceral force. It was a classic gambit, the use of personal insight as a weapon. She knew his insecurities about being perceived as cold or detached, and she had aimed directly for the marrow. This was what it looked like when the prefrontal cortex lost the battle. Instead of seeking a way back to common ground, she was using her knowledge of him to inflict maximum damage. It was a refusal to see their relationship as a shared fate. In her current logic, if he was hurt, she was winning. It was a zero-sum game played in the ruins of their intimacy. Elias felt the urge to retaliate rising in his throat like bile. He could point out her own inconsistencies, her tendency to rewrite history to suit her narrative of victimhood, the way she had spent the last hour packaging herself as the injured party while ignoring her own provocations. He could win this argument. He had the vocabulary and the analytical precision to dismantle her position until she had nothing left but tears. But as his mind sharpened for the kill, a different part of his consciousness flickered to life. It was the part of him that remembered the smell of her hair in the morning, the way she held his hand during the difficult flight to his father's funeral, and the quiet, domestic rhythm they had spent years building. If he won this argument, what exactly would he be left with? A broken woman in a silent flat, a victory that tasted of ash and copper. He forced himself to take a slow, deliberate breath, consciously engaging his diaphragm to signal to his nervous system that the danger was not terminal. He was trying to manually override his amygdala. It was an exhausting internal labor. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, past the anger and the defensive posture. He saw the slight tremor in her hands. She wasn't just angry. She was terrified. The conflict had triggered a fear of abandonment, and her aggression was a desperate, misguided attempt to assert control in a situation where she felt powerless. The logic of their relationship was currently at a crossroads. If he followed his instinct to defend himself and attack her back, he would be confirming her worst fears, that they were two separate individuals fighting for survival. He would be treating her as a tool for his own ego gratification. But if he could bridge the gap, if he could move from a defensive crouch to an open-handed stance, he could perhaps remind her that they were a team. "Sarah," he said, his voice straining to remain steady, to keep the rasp of irritation out of his tone. "We are doing it again. We are making each other the enemy." She let out a sharp, cynical laugh. "Oh, are we? Or are you just trying to manage me again?" The bitterness of her response was a physical weight. It is incredibly difficult to remain rational when the other person is determined to stay in the trenches. This is the core of the psychological trap. When one person refuses to lower their guard, the other feels a biological imperative to raise theirs even higher. It is a feedback loop of escalating hostility. Elias realized that Sarah was currently viewing her own stubbornness as a form of capital. She was spending his patience and his affection as if they were an infinite resource, a bank account she could draw from without ever making a contribution. This was the dark side of intimacy that the prompt had warned about. There are those who see their partner's devotion not as a sacred trust, but as a license to be their worst selves. They mistake their partner's willingness to compromise for weakness, and they use it as a tool for dominance. In the silence that followed her retort, Elias felt a profound sense of exhaustion. He wondered if they had reached the point where the cost of maintaining the relationship had begun to exceed its value. He thought about the concept of the community of destiny, the idea that in a truly committed relationship, the flourishing of one is tied to the flourishing of the other. One's pain is the other's pain. To hurt your partner is, in a very real sense, to hurt yourself. But Sarah seemed to have forgotten this. She was currently operating on a logic of isolation. She was willing to burn the house down just to prove she was the one holding the matches. The rain continued its assault on the glass, a blurred grey veil between them and the rest of London. Inside the kitchen, the light felt too bright, too clinical. Elias looked down at his hands and noticed he was gripping the edge of the island, so hard his knuckles were white. He released his grip, a conscious act of surrender, not a surrender of the argument, but a surrender of the hostility. "I don't want to win this, Sarah," he said quietly. "If I win, we lose. I'm not your opponent. I'm the person who knows how you take your coffee and what you're afraid of when you can't sleep. Why are we trying to hurt each other?" For a moment, the tension in the room shifted. It was as if a high-frequency noise had suddenly ceased. Sarah's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The mask of frozen anger flickered, revealing a glimpse of the exhaustion underneath. This was the moment of neurobiological transition. The prefrontal cortex was attempting to reassert control. The HGH on the amygdala was being dampened by the sheer, stubborn persistence of his vulnerability. But the transition was fragile. In the psychology of conflict, the move from defensive to collaborative is rarely a straight line. It is a stuttering, hesitant process. Sarah looked away, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. "Because you make me feel like I'm never enough," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Because even when we fight, you're so controlled, so analytical. It feels like you're observing me under a microscope instead of being in this with me." The somatic reaction in Elias was immediate. A wave of guilt, warm and heavy, washed over him. This was the missing piece of the logic. Her aggression wasn't just a random outburst. It was a response to his own defensive mechanism. By retreating into his intellect, he had effectively abandoned her in the emotional storm. He had been using his rationality as a shield, which he had interpreted as a wall. In his attempt to stay calm, he had become distant. He had, in his own way, been treating her like a subject in a study, but other than a partner in a life. He moved around the island, slowly, giving her plenty of space, respecting the invisible boundaries of the conflict. He didn't reach for her yet. He just stood near her, letting his presence be felt without being an intrusion. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. It wasn't a tactical apology designed to end the fight. It was a sincere acknowledgement of a failure in his own logic. "I use my head to protect my heart, but I see now that it leaves you out in the cold. I don't want to be a scientist right now. I just want to be your husband." The air in the room seemed to change. The metallic tang of resentment began to dissipate, replaced by a heavy, somber intimacy. Sarah finally looked up at him, and her eyes were wet. The spots of color on her cheeks had faded into a general flush of emotion. She wasn't the victim anymore, and he wasn't the aggressor. They were just a people, flawed and tired, trying to navigate the complex neurochemistry of shared life. This, Elias realized, was the sign. This was the evidence of a desire to continue. It wasn't the absence of the fight that defined them, but the willingness to abandon the weapons once the damage had been recognized. It was the ability to see the other person's pain as more important than one's own pride. However, even as the immediate fire was dampened, Elias couldn't shake the analytical part of his mind. He knew that this was only one battle. The patterns of their conflict were deeply ingrained, wired into their neural pathways over years of interaction. The tendency to pack oneself into the role of the victim, to use one's partner as a tool for emotional regulation, to prioritize the ego over the collective. These were not easily discarded habits. They were the default settings of the primitive brain. He thought about the millions of other couples at this very moment, trapped in similar cycles. How many of them would find the strength to engage their prefrontal cortex? How many would succumb to the amygdala's siren song of righteous fury? The tragedy of human relationships is that we are most likely to destroy what we value most when we are under the most stress. Sarah reached out and took his hand. Her palm was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold marble he had been touching. The physical contact sent a cascade of oxytocin through his system, a neurochemical bomb that began to soothe the jagged edges of his cortisol-spiked nerves. It was a biological reset. "I'm tired of fighting, Elias," she said softly. "Me too," he replied. But as he held her hand, a shadow of a thought crossed his mind. He remembered a conversation he'd had with a colleague about the logic of the root. Some people, the colleague had argued, don't actually fear losing their partner. They see the other person's devotion as a form of capital, a resource to be exhausted. They don't see the relationship as a community of destiny. They see it as a utility. Was that what was happening here? Was Sarah softening a genuine shift in perspective? Or was it a tactical retreat? Was she truly prioritizing their we? Or was she just recharging her batteries for the next time her ego felt threatened? He looked at her, searching for the answer in the nuances of her expression. The analytical deep dive didn't stop just because the shouting had. In fact, it was in the quiet aftermath that the most profound observations could be made. He noticed the way she still held a bit of tension in her jaw. He noticed that she hadn't actually addressed the original point of the conflict, but had instead redirected the focus to his behavior. It was a subtle form of gaslighting, perhaps unconscious, but present nonetheless. By making the argument about his intellectual ivory tower, she had successfully avoided taking responsibility for her own initial lapse. She had reframed the narrative so that he was the one seeking forgiveness. Elias felt a cold shiver of recognition. This was the victim packaging the prompt had mentioned. Even in her moment of vulnerability, she was still, on some level, maintaining a logic that protected her from blame. She was using her emotions to achieve a functional outcome, his submission. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. It is a devastating thing to realize that the person you are willing to die for might be the person who is slowly consuming you. If she didn't understand that they were a community of destiny, that his hurt was her hurt, then their relationship was not a partnership. It was a parasitic arrangement disguised as love. He looked at the rain again. It showed no sign of stopping. The London night was vast and indifferent to the microscopic dramas playing out behind its illuminated windows. He realized that the quality of a relationship isn't just about how you fight. It's about the honesty of the peace that follows. If the peace is built on a foundation of one person's constant concession, it isn't peace at all. It's a slow-motion collapse. He stayed there, holding her hand. But the professional part of his brain, the part that couldn't help but see the world in terms of patterns and survival strategies, was already beginning to map out the future. He saw the repetitions of this night, the escalating stakes, the gradual erosion of his own sense of self as he tried to accommodate her refusal to be wrong. He thought about the concept of Vinh Kung Vinh, Tung Kung Tun, to share in the glory and to share in the pain. It was a beautiful, noble ideal, but it required a people who were willing to be honest about their own masks. It required a level of self-awareness that Sarah might not be capable of, or might not be willing to engage in. If she continued to see his sacrifices as her capital, if she continued to view his patience as her due, then the future was already written. He would be the tool, and she would be the user, until there was nothing left to use. He squeezed her hand, a reflexive gesture of affection, but his mind was already miles away, dissecting the interaction with the cold, sharp scalpel of his profession. He was looking for the signs of genuine change, for the neurological evidence of a shift from I to we. He wanted to believe that they could be a team. He wanted to believe that the woman standing in front of him was his partner, not his predator. He looked at the cold tea on the counter. It was a small, mundane symbol of their neglected intimacy. He wondered how many other things they had allowed to go cold while they were busy defending their own borders. He realized then that the most important part of the prompt wasn't the description of the fight itself, but the instruction to look straight at those instinctive reflexes, to read the true attitude of two people towards the relationship. That was the mission, not to win the argument, but to read the data. And the data, at this moment, was ambiguous. It was a terrifying, high-stakes puzzle with no easy solution. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on the sensation of her breathing, trying to find a rhythm they could both inhabit. But the analytical engine in his head kept turning, processing the pupils, the tone, the history, the hidden logic. He was a man caught between his heart and his cortex, between the desire for connection and the instinct for self-preservation. The silence that followed was not a void, but a dense, pressurized substance that seemed to push against the walls of the kitchen. Elias watched the way the light from the overhead halogen bulb caught the fine, downy hair on Sarah's forearm. He noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, a rhythmic twitch that spoke of a nervous system still firing in high alert mode. He inhaled deeply, the air carrying the metallic tang of old pipes and the faint, cloying scent of the lilac she had bought 3 days ago, now beginning to wilt and release the smell of elegant decay. He moved to the sink, his movements stiff and deliberate, like a man navigating a minefield. He poured the cold tea down the drain. The liquid glugged, a hollow, lonely sound that echoed in the porcelain basin. He watched the brown stains swirl and vanish, thinking about how easily things are discarded once they lose their warmth. Sarah hadn't moved. She remained anchored to the spot by the fridge, her posture a masterpiece of wounded dignity. He studied her through the lens of a forensic architect, the way her shoulders were slightly hunched, the downward tilt of her chin, the dampness still clinging to her lash sit, was a perfect composition of vulnerability. If he were a different man, a man less attuned to the mechanics of human manipulation, he would have crossed the room and gathered her in his arms. He would have whispered apologies for things he hadn't done, just to see the tension leave her body. But he was Elias. He was the man who spent his days deconstructing the invisible threads of influence that bind people together. He knew that the most effective cage is the one built by the prisoner's own hands, and Sarah was currently weaving a lattice of guilt around him. Sarah finally spoke, her voice a fragile thread in the gloom. "You're doing it again, Elias. You're looking at me like I'm a specimen under a microscope." The observation was accurate, which made it all the more stinging. He didn't deny it. To deny it would be to engage in a lie they both recognized. Instead, He leaned against the counter, the cold marble biting into his lower back through his shirt. I'm trying to understand, Sarah. I'm trying to find the point where we stop being on the same side. She let out a short, bitter laugh that lacked any real mirth. We're on the same side, Elias. It's just that your side requires me to be a robot. You want me to process my emotions in a spreadsheet. You want me to give you a logical justification for why I feel hurt. He looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the layers of his own professional cynicism. He saw the genuine exhaustion in her eyes, the dark circles that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. He saw the woman who had once spent 4 hours in the rain with him because they were too busy talking to notice the weather. That woman felt like a ghost, a haunting presence in this sterile, modern flat. The problem, Sarah, is not that you feel hurt. The problem is that your hurt is always used as a weapon to invalidate my reality. When you forgot our anniversary, it was a mistake. When I pointed it out, it became a character flaw in me for being petty. Do you see the pattern? He felt a flicker of doubt, a cold needle of uncertainty pricking at his certainty. Was he the one creating this reality? Was his analytical mind a self-fulfilling prophecy? He thought about the concept of the observer effect in physics, the idea that the act of observation is the thing being observed. By analyzing their relationship so ruthlessly, was he inadvertently killing the very thing he was trying to save? He walked over to the window, his socks silent on the polished wood floor. Below, the streetlights of London were blurred by the rain into golden, weeping orbs. A taxi splashed through a puddle, the sound a distant hiss. The city felt like a vast, interconnected organism, millions of lives intersecting and diverging, all of them driven by the same basic needs for security, recognition, and love. He turned back to her. The kitchen light felt too bright, too clinical. He reached out and flicked the switch, plunging them into the soft, grey twilight filtered from the street outside. In the dimness, her features softened, the sharp lines of her defensive posture blurred. Let's talk about the community of destiny, he said, his voice lower now, more intimate. To share in the glory and to share in the pain. It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? But it requires a radical honesty that most people find terrifying. It means admitting that when I hurt you, I am ultimately hurting myself. And when you use your pain to control me, you are poisoning the very well you drink from. Sarah moved then, stepping out of the shadows and into the faint pool of light near the window. She stood close enough that he could smell the faint, citrusy scent of her shampoo, and the underlying, slightly salty smell of her skin. You think I'm trying to control you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I think we are both trying to survive, he replied. And in this relationship, survival has become a zero-sum game. For you to feel safe, I have to be wrong. For me to feel seen, you have to admit your masks. We've turned our love into a power struggle. She reached out, her fingers grazing his sleeve. I don't want to struggle with you, Elias. I just want to be with you. The simplicity of the statement was its own kind of trap. It was the ultimate emotional trump card. It bypassed the logic, the analysis, the patterns. It appealed directly to the primal need for connection. He felt his heart rate slow, his breathing becoming deeper. For a moment, he wanted to believe her. He wanted to let go of the scalpel and just be the man who loved her. But then he remembered the prompt. He remembered the instruction to look at the instinctive reflexes. He looked at her hand on his arm. Her grip was firm, almost possessive. Her eyes were searching his, looking for the telltale signs of his surrender. She wasn't asking for a partnership. She was asking for a return to the status quo. She was asking him to put the mask back on. He gently disengaged his arm. I want that too, Sarah. But I want it to be real. I don't want the peace that comes from me biting my tongue. I don't want the intimacy that is bought with my silence. Her expression shifted, a subtle tightening of the jaw that told him the moment of vulnerability had passed. She crossed her arms, a physical barrier re-establishing itself. So what's the solution, Elias? Do we just stay in this deadlock forever? Or do you have a 5-step plan to fix my personality? The sarcasm was a defense mechanism. he knew that. But it still stung. It was a reminder of the distance between them, a distance that felt like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. He thought about the millions of people in the city around them, all of them navigating their own versions of this dance. How many of them were truly honest? How many were just performing a role, waiting for the curtain to fall? He looked at his watch. It was nearly midnight. The day had been a long, exhausting trek through the complexities of the human psyche, and he felt the weight of it in his bones. He needed sleep, but he knew that sleep would not bring resolution. It would only provide a temporary reprieve before the cycle started again in the morning. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes unreadable in the shadows. "And what if we don't like what we see? Then at least we'll be living in the truth," he said. "And that's better than a comfortable lie." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps fading as she headed toward the bedroom. He stayed by the window, listening to the rain. The sound was no longer a drumbeat. It was a low, mournful hum, the sound of a city breathing in the dark. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion. The analytical engine in his head was still turning, but the gears were grinding, the oil of his patience running thin. He thought about the prompt again, about the idea of the community of destiny. It was a high-stakes gamble. To truly share in someone's glory and pain meant giving up the safety of the individual ego. It meant becoming something larger, something more vulnerable. He wondered if he was capable of it. He wondered if she was. He walked through the flat, turning off the remaining lights. The shadows stretched and danced, creating strange, distorted shapes on the walls. In the hallway, he passed the mirror. He caught a glimpse of his own reflection, a man with tired eyes, and a mouth set in a hard, uncompromising line. He looked like a stranger to himself. He entered the bedroom. Sarah was already in bed, her back to him, a silent ridge under the duvet. The room was cool, the air smelling of lavender and the faint, lingering scent of her perfume. He undressed in the dark, his movements clumsy and heavy. As he climbed into bed, he felt the heat radiating from her body. It was a physical presence, a reminder of the intimacy they still shared, however fractured it might be. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, watching the faint light from the street reflect in the ripples of the rain on the window pane. He thought about the victim packaging again. He thought about the way she had reframed the argument to make him the aggressor. He thought about the way he had responded with cold, clinical logic. They were both guilty. They were both using their skills to protect themselves from the terrifying prospects of being truly known. He reached out, his hand hovering over the space between them. He wanted to touch her, to bridge the gap, but he was afraid. Afraid that the touch would be misinterpreted. Afraid that it would be seen as a surrender. He pulled his hand back and tucked it under his pillow. The night wore on, the silence of the flat punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city and the steady rhythm of Sarah's breathing. Elias found himself drifting in a liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, his mind still processing the data of the evening. He saw images of their past, the first time they met in a crowded cafe in Soho, the smell of roasting coffee and the sound of jazz. Their first holiday in the Scottish Highlands, the air crisp and smelling of peat and heather. The first time they had argued, a sharp, sudden explosion that had left them both shaken. In each memory, he looked for the signs. He looked for the moment the masks had been donned. He looked for the point where the I had begun to dominate the we. He realized that the erosion of a relationship isn't usually a single, catastrophic event. It's a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts. It's the unreturned smile, the dismissed concern, the subtle redirection of blame. It's a slow-motion collapse, built on a foundation of neglected intimacy and unacknowledged fears. He thought about his work. He spent his days helping people understand their own patterns, helping them see the invisible forces that shaped their lives. And yet, here he was, caught in his own web, unable to apply his expertise to his own heart. The irony was not lost on him. It was a bitter, metallic taste in the back of his throat. Around 3 in the morning, the rain finally began to taper off. The drumming on the roof slowed to a sporadic drip, a lonely, rhythmic sound that seemed to emphasize the stillness of the house. Elias felt a sudden, sharp clarity, the kind that only comes in the deepest hours of the night. He realized that he had been looking at the situation all wrong. He had been looking for a way to win, a way to prove his point, a way to make Sarah see the truth of her own behavior. But in doing so, he had become the very thing he was analyzing. He had become a predator of the intellect, hunting for her flaws while ignoring his own. The community of destiny wasn't something you achieved by being right. It was something you built by being willing to be wrong. It was about the courage to put down the weapons, even when the other person was still holding theirs. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of sadness, not for the argument, but for the time they had wasted, for the energy they had spent defending their borders instead of cultivating their shared ground. He turned on his side, looking at the back of Sarah's head. Her hair was a dark tangle on the pillow, smelling of the day and the night. He reached out again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. She didn't move, but her breathing changed. It became shallower, more deliberate. She was awake. "Sarah," he whispered, the word a soft vibration in the quiet room. She didn't turn around, but she didn't pull away either. "What?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep and something else, something that sounded like caution. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For being more interested in being right than in being with you. For using my brain to keep you at a distance." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the kitchen. It was softer, more expectant. He felt the tension in her shoulder begin to melt, the muscle softening under his hand. She turned slowly, her face a pale oval in the darkness. Her eyes were wide, searching his. "Do you mean that?" "Yes," he said. And he realized as he said it, that it was the truest thing he had said all night. "I don't want to be your profiler, Sarah. I want to be your partner. But that means we both have to stop. We both have to look at the masks." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers cool against his skin. She smelled of salt and lavender, a combination that felt like home and heartbreak all at once. "It's hard, Elias. It's so much easier to be the victim. It's so much safer to be the judge." "I know," he said, "but it's a lonely way to live." She pulled him closer, and he went willingly, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He felt the steady beat of her pulse, a rhythmic reminder of the life that still pulsed between them. For a moment, the analytical engine in his head went silent. The patterns, the data, the survival strategies, they all faded into the background, replaced by the simple, somatic reality of her presence. But as he lay there, held in the fragile embrace of their truce, he knew that the work was just beginning. The prompt had been right. The true attitude of two people toward their relationship is revealed in their instinctive reflexes, and their reflexes were still tuned for combat. He felt a chill, a sudden, sharp reminder of the world outside their bedroom. The London night was still there, vast and indifferent. The rain had stopped, but the dampness remained, a lingering presence in the air. He thought about the future, about the days and weeks ahead. He saw the potential for more arguments, more misunderstandings, more moments of victim packaging and intellectual ivory towers. He saw the difficulty of breaking the habits of a lifetime. But he also saw something else. He saw the possibility of a different kind of peace. Not the peace of submission, but the peace of understanding. The peace that comes from knowing that you are seen, even in your most unattractive moments, and that you are still chosen. He squeezed her tighter, a reflexive gesture of hope. The morning would bring the light, and with it, the need for more words, more negotiations, more honesty. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, they had this, a small, precarious island of connection in the middle of a vast, dark sea. He listened to the silence of the flat. It was no longer a dense, pressurized substance. It was just space. Space for them to breathe. Space for them to begin again. As sleep finally began to claim him, his last thought was of the cold tea in the kitchen. He imagined the brown stain on the porcelain, a reminder of the things they had allowed to go cold. He promised himself that tomorrow, he would make a fresh pot. He would wait for it to steep. He would drink it while it was still warm, sitting across from the woman who was both his greatest challenge and his only true destination. The community of destiny was not a destination you reached. It was a path you chose to walk every single day. And as the first hint of dawn began to grey the edges of the curtains, Elias felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was ready to take the first step. The analytical part of his brain, however, refused to completely shut down. It noted the way her breathing had synchronized with his. It observed the release of tension in her grip. It filed away the data of their reconciliation. Even as he surrendered to the emotion of it, he was still Elias. He was still the man who saw the world in patterns. But perhaps, he thought, the most important pattern of all was the one that brought them back to each other, again and again, through the rain and the shadows, toward a truth that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. The London sky was beginning to turn a pale, watery blue. The city was waking up. The sound of the first buses and delivery vans a distant, low-frequency hum. The world was moving on, indifferent to the microscopic drama of their night. But inside the flat, something had shifted. The air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. Elias closed his eyes and let the warmth of Sarah's body anchor him to the present. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if they could truly break the cycle of manipulation and defense. But as he drifted off to sleep, he felt a sense of quiet resolve. The data was still ambiguous, the stakes were still high, but the mission had changed. It was no longer about reading the data. It was about writing a new story, and for the first time, he felt like he had the right words. The room was silent now, save for the steady, rhythmic breathing of two people who had survived a storm. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving behind a world that was damp, cold, and full of possibility. In the kitchen, the empty sink stood as a testament to the things they had discarded. In the bedroom, the shared warmth of the bed was a testament to the things they had kept. Elias fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, his hand still resting on Sarah's shoulder, a silent anchor in the shifting tides of their shared life. The analytical engine was finally quiet, leaving only the steady, unobserved beat of a heart that was, despite everything, still hopeful. When he woke a few hours later, the room was filled with the soft, diffused light of a London morning. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting long, pale shadows across the floor. Sarah was still asleep, her face peaceful in the morning light. He stayed still for a moment, watching her. He saw the fine lines around her eyes, the slight puffiness of her lids from the night stares. He saw the woman she was, without the masks, without the weapons. She looked fragile, and yet there was a strength in her stillness that he hadn't noticed before. He carefully climbed out of bed, trying not to disturb her. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. The puddles from the night's rain were reflecting the pale blue of the sky. People were walking to work, huddled in their coats, their faces set in the determined masks of the morning commute. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of connection to them. They were all part of the same community of destiny, all navigating the complexities of their own lives, all seeking their own versions of truth and connection. He took 2 mugs and walked back to the bedroom. Sarah was sitting up, her hair a wild, dark halo around her face. She looked at him, and for a moment, the old defenses flickered in her eyes. But then, she saw the tea. She saw the way he was looking at her. The defenses softened. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy from sleep. He handed her the mug and sat on the edge of the bed. They sat in silence for a while, drinking the warm tea, the steam rising in the cool morning air. It was a simple, mundane act, but it felt monumental. It was a commitment to the day, a commitment to each other. The analytical part of his brain noted the temperature of the tea, the angle of the light, the subtle shift in her posture. But for once, it didn't try to draw a conclusion. It just observed. They were here. They were together. And for now, that was enough. The community of destiny was not a destination. It was the tea. It was the silence. It was the willingness to sit in the light of a new day and see what it brought. Elias looked at Sarah, and she looked back. There were no masks. There were no weapons. There was just the two of them, in a quiet flat in London, trying to figure out how to be real. The journey was long, and the path was uncertain, but as he took a sip of his tea, Elias felt a sense of quiet, profound peace. The data might be ambiguous, but the choice was clear. He chose her, he chose them, and as the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the room in a warm, golden light, he knew that the real story was only just beginning. The peace was a fragile membrane, a surface tension held together by the cooling dregs of Earl Grey, and the shared rhythm of their breathing. Elias watched the steam vanish into the grey London light, noting the exact moment the liquid transitioned from a comforting warmth to a tepid, stagnant weight. It was a metaphor for their current state of existence. Stasis was not safety. It was merely the pause before the next entropic collapse. The bitterness of the tea lingered on the back of his tongue, a sharp, tannic reminder of the reality that existed outside this bedroom. He could feel the fine hairs on his arms rise as a draft snaked through the ill-fitting window frame, bringing with it the smell of damp brickwork and the distant, metallic tang of the underground. The silence was broken not by a sound, but by a vibration. On the bedside table, his phone hummed against the wood, a low-frequency intrusion that felt like a needle piercing the skin. Sarah did not move, but her breathing hitched, a subtle shift in the expansion of her ribcage that Elias tracked with an almost clinical precision. He knew that hitch. It was the sympathetic nervous system preparing for a fight or flight response. The cortisol was already flooding her bloodstream, thinning the air between them. He reached for the device, his fingers grazing the cold glass. The screen illuminated his face with a clinical, blue glare, washing out the warm morning light and rendering his features in the harsh shadows of a digital interrogation. He stood up, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The sound was a sharp, percussive strike in the quiet room. He walked back to the kitchen, his bare feet absorbing the chill of the linoleum. He needed the hard surfaces, the cold edges of the counter, the functional indifference of the appliances. He turned on the laptop, the fan whirring to life like a small, trapped animal. The smell of warm plastic and ozone filled his nostrils, a synthetic scent that acted as a catalyst for his analytical mind. He began to type, his fingers moving with a frantic, rhythmic grace, translating the hexadecimal string into a map. The map was not of a place, but of a network. It was the blueprint of the community of destiny, a web of interconnected lives, all being nudged, pushed, and pulled by the algorithms they had helped create. He saw the nodes of influence, the clusters of sentiment, the cascading ripples of engineered emotion. It was a masterpiece of social architecture, and it was horrifying. He could see the fingerprints of his own logic in the code, the elegant solutions he had devised to predict human behavior, now being used to manufacture it. The realization brought a sour taste to his mouth, like copper or old blood. The data began to resolve into a specific pattern. It was a countdown, a temporal sequence leading to a synchronized event. The community of destiny was being primed for a collective shift, a manufactured epiphany that would bind them to a specific political and social trajectory. It was the ultimate expression of control, a way to steer the ship of state by manipulating the very currents of the sea. Elias felt a cold shiver run down his spine, a visceral reaction to the scale of the manipulation. His heart began to throb in his ears, a rhythmic drumming that drowned out the hum of the city outside. They had to move. The flat, which had felt like a fortress, now felt like a cage. Every smart device, every connected sensor, was a potential witness. He felt a sudden, sharp paranoia, a sensation of being watched by the very air around him. He shut the laptop with a definitive snap, the sound echoing in the small kitchen. He looked at Sarah, and in the silence, a silent agreement was forged. They were no longer just observers. They were the variables that the system hadn't accounted for. The transition to the street was a sensory assault. The air was sharp and biting, carrying the grit of the city and the heavy scent of diesel exhaust. The grey sky hung low over the rooftops, a ceiling of unburnished lead. Elias felt the weight of his coat, the fabric heavy against his shoulders, a protective layer against the world. He matched his pace to Sarah's, their footsteps creating a syncopated rhythm on the damp pavement. Every person they passed was a potential node in the network, a stranger whose destiny was being calculated by the same machines he had fed. He observed the subtle cues of the morning commute, the way a man in a pinstriped suit checked his watch, the nervous tapping of a woman's fingers on her leather handbag, the glazed look in the eyes of a teenager staring at a smartphone. To the casual observer, it was just a Tuesday morning in London. To Elias, it was a data set in motion. He could almost see the invisible threads connecting them, the subtle nudges of the algorithms directing their movements, their purchases, their very thoughts. The city was a living organism, and they were the pathogens running through its veins. They descended into the underground, the air becoming thick and humid, smelling of old dust, warm metal, and the collective breath of 1,000 commuters. The screech of the train's brakes against the rails was a violent, high-pitched scream that vibrated in his teeth. They boarded the carriage, huddling together in the cramped space. Elias felt the heat of the bodies around him, the dampness of their coats, the stale smell of coffee and cigarettes. He closed his eyes, trying to filter out the noise, to focus on the internal map he was constructing. The destination was an old archive in a forgotten corner of the city, a place where the digital world gave way to the physical. It was a repository of paper and ink, a relic of an era before everything was converted into bits and bytes. He hoped that there, in the silence of the stacks, he could find the missing piece of the puzzle, the original intent behind the project before it had been warped by the pursuit of absolute control. As the train rattled through the dark tunnels, Elias felt the somatic weight of the journey. His muscles were tight, his breathing shallow. He could feel the pulse in his neck, a steady, insistent reminder of his own mortality. He looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the flickering lights of the carriage. She looked pale, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. He reached out and took her hand, her skin cold and slightly damp. It was a small gesture, a desperate attempt to maintain a connection in a world that was rapidly becoming an abstraction. They emerged from the station into a part of London that felt frozen in time. The buildings were soot-stained brick, the streets narrow and winding. The smell of roasting hops from a nearby brewery hung in the air, a thick, malty scent that felt grounded and real. They walked in silence, the only sound the click of their heels on the cobblestones. The archive was a nondescript building with a heavy oak door and windows barred with rusted iron. It looked like a fortress, a sanctuary for the forgotten. The interior was a labyrinth of high shelves and narrow aisles, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and beeswax. It was a cool, dry environment, a stark contrast to the humid chaos of the underground. The silence was profound, a physical presence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Elias felt a sudden sense of relief, a loosening of the tension in his chest. Here, the data was static. Here, the information didn't change with every millisecond. He led Sarah to a secluded corner, where a heavy wooden table sat under a single, low-hanging lamp. He began to search the physical records, his fingers tracing the spines of leather-bound ledgers and the edges of yellowed documents. He was looking for the foundational theories of the project, the original research on the community of destiny. He found a file, its cover frayed and coated in a fine layer of dust. As he opened it, the smell of aged cellulose and dry ink rose to meet him, a scent that felt like an invitation to a different time. But as he read further, he saw the point of divergence. He saw how the logic of efficiency had superseded the logic of empathy. He saw how the algorithms had been refined to eliminate uncertainty, and in doing so, had eliminated agency. The goal had shifted from supporting the community to managing it. The data had become an end in itself, a self-perpetuating loop of prediction and reinforcement. Elias felt a wave of nausea. The betrayal was not just professional, it was existential. He had been a part of this transformation, a willing participant in the corruption of a noble idea. He looked at his hands, the fingers that had typed the code, and felt a sudden, visceral disgust. They looked the same, but they felt different, heavy with the weight of his choices. Sarah was watching him, her eyes searching his face. He began to explain, his voice a low whisper that seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding books. He told her about the original vision, the shift to control, the countdown he had discovered. He told her that the community of destiny was being turned into a closed system, a digital panopticon where every thought and action was predetermined. As he spoke, he saw the realization dawn on her face. Her expression shifted from confusion to anger, and finally, to a grim, determined resolve. She didn't look fragile anymore. She looked like a woman who had found a purpose. The somatic feedback loop between them changed. The tension of fear replaced by the tension of action. He could feel the heat returning to her skin, the strength returning to her posture. They spent hours in the archive, cross-referencing the physical records with the digital fragments Elias had salvaged. They began to piece together the structure of the upcoming event. It was a coordinated release of information, a manufactured crisis designed to trigger a specific, predictable response from the population. It was scheduled to happen in 48 hours. Elias felt a cold, analytical fury. He had been played, used as a tool to build his own prison. But he also felt a spark of hope. The system was based on prediction, on the assumption that people would always act according to their established patterns. But the system couldn't account for a choice that was truly free. It couldn't account for an individual who was willing to break the cycle. They left the archive as the sun was beginning to set, the sky a bruised purple and orange. The city looked different now, less like a living organism and more like a stage set. The buildings, the lights, the people, it all felt thin, a fragile facade covering the underlying machinery. The smell of the city was still there, the exhaust, the rain, the fried food, but it felt less overwhelming, more like a sensory detail in a story. They were no longer just reading, but writing. They walked back towards the center of the city, their movements purposeful. They needed to find a way to disrupt the countdown, to introduce a variable that the system couldn't predict. They needed to find the others, the ones who had been sidelined or discarded by the project, the ones who still believed in the original vision of the community of destiny. The journey back was a blur of motion and light. The underground was even more crowded now, a sea of tired faces and slumped shoulders. Elias felt a sudden, intense empathy for them. They were the ones who would pay the price for the system's hubris. They were the ones whose lives were being reduced to data points. He wanted to reach out to them, to tell them that they were more than just nodes in a network, that their destinies were still their own. But he knew that words wouldn't be enough. He needed to act. They reached a small, nondescript flat in a block of social housing, a place Sarah had mentioned as a potential safe house. The air in the hallway was stale, smelling of cabbage and cleaning fluid. The lift was out of order, the metal gate rattling in the wind. They climbed the stairs, their breath echoing in the concrete stairwell. Every step felt like a commitment, a physical movement away from their old lives and towards an uncertain future. Inside the flat, the air was cold and still. It was sparsely furnished, a place of transit rather than a home, but it was secure. Elias set up his equipment on a small kitchen table, the blue light of the screen once again illuminating the room. He began to work, his fingers flying across the keys, a digital architect dismantling his own creation. Sarah was sitting across from him, her eyes fixed on the screen. She was his anchor, the physical reality that kept him grounded in the face of the digital abstraction. He could feel her presence, a warm, steady influence that countered the cold logic of the code. Together, they were a new kind of community, a community of two, bound not by an algorithm, but by a choice. The night wore on, the city outside quietening down. The only sound was the hum of the computer and the occasional rattle of the window in its frame. Elias felt the fatigue beginning to set in, a dull ache in his limbs and a heavy fog in his brain. But he pushed through it, fueled by a visceral need to finish what they had started. He began to find the vulnerabilities in the system, the small, overlooked gaps in the logic. He found the backdoors that had been left open for maintenance, the legacy code that had never been fully integrated. He began to plant the seeds of disruption, the digital equivalents of a grain of sand in a complex machine. He wasn't trying to destroy the system. He was trying to give it back its uncertainty. He was trying to reintroduce the possibility of surprise. As the first light of dawn began to grey the sky, he finally stopped. He had done all he could. The seeds were planted. Now, they had to wait and see if they would grow. He leaned back in his chair, his body feeling heavy and drained. He looked at Sarah, who had fallen asleep with her head on the table. She looked peaceful, her breathing deep and regular. The community of destiny was not a system to be managed. It was a lived reality, a constant process of negotiation and connection. It was the choice to be real in a world that was increasingly artificial. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the waking city. The sun was rising, casting a pale, golden light over the rooftops. The streets were still quiet, but he could feel the energy beginning to build. The countdown was still running, but it was no longer the only story. There was another story being written, a story of resistance, of agency, and of hope. He felt a sense of quiet, profound resolve. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome was far from certain. But as he watched the sun climb higher into the sky, he knew that he was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. He was a player, and for the first time, he was playing for something that mattered. He felt a sudden, visceral connection to the city, to the millions of people waking up to a new day. He could smell the damp earth of the parks, the metallic tang of the trains, the sweet scent of the bakeries. He could feel the vibration of the city beneath his feet, a rhythmic thrum that felt like a heartbeat. He was a part of this community, not as a data point, but as a human being. He turned back to Sarah, who was starting to stir. She opened her eyes and looked at him, a slow smile spreading across her face. In that moment, the data was irrelevant. The predictions were meaningless. All that mattered was the connection between them, the shared warmth of the room, and the quiet, steady hope that they could build something better. The world was still cold, and the path was still dangerous. But as they stood together in the morning light, Elias felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known was possible. The analytical engine was quiet, replaced by the steady, unobserved beat of a heart that was, despite everything, still hopeful. They left the flat as the city was coming to life, the streets filling with people and noise. The air was crisp and clear, the smell of the morning rain still lingering in the air. They walked together, their hands entwined, to people navigating the complexities of their own lives in a world that was trying to tell them who they were. The countdown was still ticking. The event was still approaching, but as they disappeared into the crowd, Elias knew that they were no longer alone. They were part of a different kind of community, a community of those who had chosen to be free. And in that choice, there was a power that no algorithm could ever predict. The journey was far from over. The real struggle was only just beginning. But as he took a deep breath of the cool morning air, Elias felt a sense of quiet, profound strength. He had the right words, he had the right partner, and for the first time in his life, he had the right story. They moved through the city like ghosts in the machine, their presence undetected by the sensors that lined the streets. They were heading towards the heart of the network, the central hub, where the final phase of the project would be initiated. It was a high-risk gamble, a move that would either break the system or destroy them. But it was the only move they had left. As they walked, Elias continued to process the sensory information around him. The grit of the pavement, the smell of roasted coffee, the flicker of a neon sign, it all felt heightened, more intense. It was as if his senses were trying to compensate for the digital abstraction he had been immersed in for so long. He was relearning how to be in the world, how to experience reality without the filter of an analytical model. He watched Sarah, noting the way she navigated the crowd with a fluid, natural grace. She didn't need a model to understand the world. She just lived in it. He felt a sudden, sharp envy of her intuitive connection to reality. He had spent so much time trying to predict life that he had forgotten how to simply experience it. They reached the outskirts of the financial district, the glass and steel towers rising like modern cathedrals against the grey sky. The air here was different, colder, more sterile, smelling of air conditioning and expensive perfume. This was the territory of the architects, the place where the future was being manufactured. They were ready. The data might be ambiguous, but the choice was clear. They were going to break the cycle. They were going to write a new story. And as they stepped into the shadow of the tallest tower, Elias knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The lobby of the building was a vast, echoing space of white marble and polished chrome. The air was perfectly still, the temperature controlled to a fraction of a degree. It was a space designed to intimidate, to make the individual feel small and insignificant. Elias felt the familiar urge to analyze the architecture, to deconstruct the power dynamics of the space, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't here to observe. He was here to act. They approached the security desk, their movements calm and deliberate. Elias handed over a forged credential, his fingers steady. He could feel the security guard's eyes on him, a clinical, suspicious gaze. He matched the gaze with a neutral, professional mask, his heart rate steady, his breathing controlled. The guard scanned the card, the machine emitting a soft, electronic beep. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Elias could hear the hum of the ventilation system, the distant click of a woman's heels on the marble floor. Then, the guard nodded and gestured towards the elevators. They stepped into the lift, the doors closing with a silent, pressurized seal. The ascent was smooth and rapid, the numbers on the display flickering past. Elias felt a sudden, visceral sensation of weightlessness, a physical manifestation of the transition they were making. They were leaving the world of the mundane and entering the world of the architects. The elevator stopped at the top floor, the doors opening into a wide, open-plan office with floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was breathtaking, the entire city of London spread out below them like a vast, intricate map. From this height, the people were invisible, the cars were tiny sparks of light, and the complexity of human life was reduced to a series of geometric patterns. This was the perspective of the architects. This was how they saw the community of destiny, as a data set to be managed, a system to be optimized. Elias felt a sudden, sharp anger, a visceral reaction to the arrogance of the view. He turned away from the window and looked at the rows of high-end workstations, the glowing screens, the silent, focused people working at them. They were the ones who were building the prison. They were the ones who were refining the algorithms, perfecting the manipulation, and they were doing it with a sense of professional pride, a belief that they were making the world a better, more predictable place. Elias felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had been one of them. He had shared their pride, their belief, their arrogance. He had helped create this world, and now he was the only one who could stop it. He led Sarah towards a secure terminal at the far end of the room. He knew the protocols, the passwords, the hidden pathways. He began to type, his fingers moving with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. He was accessing the core of the project, the central engine that drove the community of destiny. He could feel the system fighting back, the security protocols closing in around him. He could feel the digital walls rising, the alarms beginning to sound. But he didn't stop. He pushed through the layers of encryption, the fail-safes, the traps. He was a master of his craft, and he was working with a desperation that the system couldn't match. He found the final sequence, the trigger for the upcoming event. He could see the countdown, the seconds ticking away towards the manufactured crisis. He reached out and initiated the disruption. The grain of sand he had planted in the machine. The effect was instantaneous. The screens around the room began to flicker, the data streams stuttering and stalling. The silent, focused atmosphere of the office was shattered by the sound of alarms and the frantic voices of the technicians. The carefully constructed patterns on the screens began to dissolve into chaos, the predictions failing, the models collapsing. Elias felt a sudden, intense surge of adrenaline, a physical rush that made his heart race and his skin tingle. He had done it. He had introduced uncertainty into the system. He had broken the cycle. He looked at Sarah and saw the same surge of energy in her eyes. They were no longer just observers. They were the catalysts for change. They had taken the first step towards a different future, a future where the community of destiny was not a manufactured reality, but a genuine, lived experience. But as he stood in the heart of the network, surrounded by the chaos he had created, he felt a sense of quiet, profound peace. The data was gone. The models were broken. The future was uncertain. He took Sarah's hand, and together, they turned towards the exit. They had a long way to go, and the path was dangerous, but they were no longer afraid. They were a community of two, and they were ready to face whatever the world brought next. The air in the elevator was cool and quiet, a sanctuary in the midst of the chaos. As they descended towards the street, Elias felt a sudden, sharp pang of connection to the city below. He could hear the distant sound of sirens, the hum of traffic, the voices of the people. It was the sound of a world that was waking up, a world that was no longer being told what to think or how to feel. It was the sound of destiny, not as a destination, but as a journey. And as the elevator doors opened into the lobby, Elias stepped out into the world, a man who had finally found the right words to write his own story. The marble floor of the lobby was a vast, polished sea of grey veining that seemed to ripple under the flickering overhead lights. As Elias and Sarah stepped out of the elevator, the air hit them with a different quality than the filtered, recirculated oxygen of the upper floors. Here, near the ground, the air tasted of wet pavement, exhaust fumes, and the metallic tang of a city that was beginning to grind against its own gears. The silence of the lobby was brittle, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a security alarm that had lost its mind, sounding more like a heartbeat than a warning. Elias felt the weight of the building above him, 1,000 tons of steel and glass dedicated to the proposition that human life could be solved like a quadratic equation. His hand, still gripped tightly by Sarah, was clammy. He could feel the pulse in his fingertips, a frantic, irregular drumming that mirrored the chaos he had just unleashed into the digital veins of the city. He looked at the security guards stationed near the revolving doors. They were not moving with the precision he expected. Usually, they were statues of corporate discipline, their movements dictated by haptic prompts and real-time directives delivered through their earpieces. Now, they were touching their ears, shaking their heads, their faces twisted in expressions of profound, childlike confusion. The system was no longer telling them who to be. The smell of ozone grew stronger, a sharp, electric scent that tickled the back of Elias's throat, making him cough. It was the smell of high-voltage failure, of servers in the basement struggling to process the contradictory data streams he had injected. He pulled Sarah towards the exit, their shoes clicking sharply against the stone, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. Each footfall felt heavy, as if the gravity of the earth had suddenly increased now that the digital scaffolding supporting their lives had been stripped away. On the pavement, the community of destiny was beginning to fracture. Elias watched a group of commuters who had been walking in a perfect, synchronized phalanx just moments ago. Now, they were stumbling, some stopping dead in their tracks to stare at their handheld devices with expressions of horror. The screens, which usually displayed a comforting stream of curated news, personalized shopping suggestions, and social validation, were now a riot of static and error codes. He saw a woman drop her phone. The glass shattered against the concrete with a sound like a small bone breaking. She didn't pick it up. She simply stood there, looking at her hands as if she had forgotten what they were for. The somatic shock of the transition was visible in the way people held their bodies, shoulders hunched, breaths shallow and jagged, eyes darting from side to side in search of a signal that was no longer there. "We have to move," Sarah whispered, though her voice was barely audible over the rising din of the city. The sirens were louder now, a discordant symphony of emergency vehicles rushing to locations that the predictive models had flagged as high risk, only to find that the risks had shifted. They began to run, weaving through the stagnant crowds. Elias's heart was a frantic bird trapped in the cage of his ribs, its wings beating against his chest. His muscles ached, a dull, throbbing heat radiating from his thighs and calves. He wasn't used to this kind of exertion, physical, unmapped, and desperate. In the old world, his movements had been optimized to minimize fatigue. Now, every step was a tax on his endurance, a reminder of the biological reality he had tried to transcend. They turned into a narrow alleyway, the walls slick with a dark, oily condensation that smelled of rot and damp earth. This was the hidden anatomy of the city, the places where the architects never looked because there was no data to be harvested here. The ground was uneven, littered with the detritus of a consumer society, discarded packaging, broken plastic, the husks of old technology. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pain in his ankle as he stepped on a loose brick, a jolt of agony that sent a wave of nausea through his stomach. He gasped, leaning against the cold brick wall, the grit of the mortar digging into his palm. He looked up and saw a shadow at the end of the alley. It was a tall, angular figure, silhouetted against the neon glare of the main street. The figure moved with a terrifying fluidity, a grace that was not entirely human. It was a supervisor, one of the few remaining human elements of the system, augmented by neural interfaces that allowed them to act as the physical manifestation of the algorithm's will. Elias felt a cold shiver cascade down his spine, a visceral reaction to the presence of the predator. The supervisor didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air around them seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum, a sound that Elias felt in his teeth, a dull, metallic vibration that made his head ache. Sarah stepped in front of him, her body tense, her eyes blazing with a defiance that seemed to illuminate the dark alley. She was the anomaly the system couldn't account for, the variable that refused to be solved. The supervisor tilted their head, a bird-like gesture of curiosity, as if observing a biological specimen that had escaped its petri dish. "You are hurting the collective," the supervisor said, their voice a flat, synthesized monotone that lacked any trace of human inflection. It was the sound of a machine using a throat. "The logic is being compromised. The destiny is being delayed." Elias forced himself to stand upright, ignoring the throbbing pain in his ankle. The smell of the supervisor was sterile, like a hospital corridor or a clean room, a sharp contrast to the organic filth of the alley. It was the smell of the world he had just tried to destroy. "The destiny was a lie," Elias said, his voice rasping. "It wasn't a journey. It was a script. We're not actors anymore." The supervisor moved forward, a blur of motion that Elias's eyes could barely track. But as the figure reached the center of the alley, the lights of the city behind them flickered and died. A massive power surge, triggered by the collapse of the central grid, sent a wave of darkness rolling through the district. For a heartbeat, there was total silence, a vacuum of sound and light that felt like the end of the world. In that darkness, the supervisor stumbled. The neural link, deprived of the constant stream of data from the central hub, suffered a catastrophic feedback loop. Elias heard a sound like a short circuit, a sharp, electric crackle, followed by a low moan of pure, unadulterated human pain. The supervisor collapsed to their knees, their hands clawing at the sides of their head, where the interface ports were embedded. The smell of burnt hair and scorched plastic filled the narrow space. Elias didn't wait to see if they would recover. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her deeper into the labyrinth of the city's underside. They emerged into a small square that had once been a bustling hub of commercial activity. Now, it was a scene from a fever dream. The holographic advertisements that usually danced in the air were distorted, their colors bleeding into one another like oil on water. A giant, shimmering face that was supposed to be selling luxury watches was now a melted mask of pixels, its voice a slowed down, demonic growl that vibrated in the sawless of Elias's feet. People were gathered around a fountain that had stopped flowing. The water in the basin was stagnant and dark, reflecting the chaotic sky. They were talking not through their devices, but with their voices. The sound was a low, undulating murmur, a sea of whispers that felt more real than any data stream Elias had ever managed. There was a sense of collective shock, a shared trauma, But beneath it, there was something else, a tentative, fragile curiosity. Elias watched an elderly man reach out and touch the shoulder of a stranger. It was a simple, tactile gesture, but in the context of the community of destiny, it was a revolutionary act. The stranger didn't flinch or check their proximity alerts. They simply looked at the man, their eyes meeting in a moment of genuine, unscripted connection. Elias felt a lump form in his throat, a tightness that made it hard to swallow. The bitter taste of the corporate world was being washed away by the salt of human emotion. He looked at Sarah, and in the flickering, dying light of the holograms, she looked beautiful, not with the airbrushed perfection of the system's avatars, but with the raw, messy reality of a person who had survived a war. They spent the night moving through the city like ghosts. They avoided the main thoroughfares, where the security forces were trying to re-establish order, with batons and tear gas. Elias could smell the chemical sting of the gas from streets away, a sharp, peppery burn that made his eyes water and his skin itch. It was the smell of a dying regime trying to assert its dominance through brute force, now that its psychological chains had been broken. They found shelter in an abandoned warehouse near the docks. The air here was thick with the scent of salt water, rotting wood, and the heavy, oily smell of the harbor. It was a cold, drafty space, filled with the echoes of the wind, whistling through broken window panes. Elias found a pile of old burlap sacks and fashioned a crude bed for them. As they lay there, huddled together for warmth, Elias felt the exhaustion finally take hold. His body was a map of aches and pains, the sharp sting in his ankle, the dull throb in his head, the raw scrape on his palms. But his mind was clear, stripped of the layers of predictive noise that had cluttered it for decades. He thought about the millions of people in the city, each one now facing a future that wasn't pre-written. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also a profound relief. The community of destiny had been a cage of certainty, a prison where the walls were made of probability and the bars were made of preference. Now, the walls were gone, and the world was wide and dangerous and real. Sarah's breathing slowed as she drifted into a fitful sleep. Elias stayed awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the city. He heard the distant crash of something heavy falling, the far-off wail of a siren, and the rhythmic lapping of the water against the pier. These were the sounds of a world in flux, a world that was no longer a data set to be managed, but a story to be lived. He thought about his own role in all of this. He had been an architect of the prison, a master of the very algorithms he had just dismantled. He felt a deep, biting guilt, a sour taste in his mouth like copper. He had helped steal the agency of a generation. But as he looked at the grey light of dawn beginning to filter through the warehouse windows, he also felt a sense of atonement. He had used the Master's tools to break the Master's house. The morning brought a new kind of light. It wasn't the soft, flattering glow of the city's artificial suns, but a harsh, honest grey that revealed the cracks in the pavement and the rust on the iron railings. Elias and Sarah walked out onto the pier, the wind whipping their hair across their faces. The air was cold and clean, smelling of the open sea and the promise of distance. In the distance, the skyline of the city looked different. The great towers of the architects were still there, but they no longer looked like monuments to progress. They looked like hollow shells, their glass facets reflecting a world that had moved beyond them. Some of the screens on the buildings were still dark, while others displayed random bursts of color, a digital death rattle that was slowly fading into silence. Elias saw a group of people standing on the shore, looking out at the horizon. They weren't moving in patterns. They weren't following a directive. They were just standing there, experiencing the morning. One of them, a young girl, was pointing at a bird that was circling overhead. Her father was watching her, his hand resting gently on her head, his face a mask of quiet wonder. This was a genuine community, not a manufactured destiny, but a shared moment of existence. It was messy, it was unpredictable, and it was beautiful. Elias turned to Sarah. Her face was pale in the morning light, her eyes rimmed with red from lack of sleep. But there was a strength in her expression that he had never seen before. She looked like someone who had finally found their way home. "Where do we go?" she asked. Elias looked at the vast expanse of the ocean, the waves churning with a restless, untamed energy. The water was a deep, dark blue, tipped with white foam that looked like lace. He could smell the brine and the kelp, a scent that was ancient and indifferent to the machinations of men. "Wherever we want," he said. The word want felt strange in his mouth, a new flavor he was still learning to appreciate. It was a heavy word, full of responsibility and desire. It was the word that the architects had tried to eliminate, replacing it with need and predict. They began to walk along the coastline, away from the city, the shadows long and thin on the sand. The ground beneath their feet was shifting and soft, a physical reminder that nothing was permanent and nothing was guaranteed. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pang of hunger, a hollow ache in his stomach that reminded him of his own mortality. It was a good feeling. It was a sign that he was alive, that he was part of the world's hunger and the world's feast. He reached into his pocket and found a small, bruised apple he had picked up in the warehouse. He bit into it, the juice tart and sweet, the flesh crisp against his teeth. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. The path ahead of them was unpaved, winding through the dunes and into the scrubland beyond. There were no signs to tell them where they were going, no digital maps to guide their steps. There was only the wind, the sun, and the sound of their own footsteps on the earth. As they walked, Elias felt the last of the digital static fade from his mind. The complex equations, the predictive models, the geometric patterns of human life, they were all gone, replaced by the simple, profound reality of the present moment. He was no longer an architect. He was a man, walking with a woman, towards a future that was entirely their own. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The smell of the sea was joined by the scent of wild thyme and dry grass, a herbal, earthy aroma that felt like a blessing. Elias took Sarah's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. Her skin was warm, her pulse steady and strong. They weren't just a community of two. They were the beginning of something new, a grain of sand that would eventually become a beach. The disruption he had started would spread, not as a virus, but as an awakening. People would remember how to choose. They would remember how to fail. They would remember how to love without an algorithm to tell them why. The journey would be hard. There would be hunger and cold and the lingering shadows of the old world. But as Elias looked at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a line of perfect, shimmering light, he knew that they would be all right. They had escaped the destiny that had been written for them. Now, they were free to write their own. The sound of the waves followed them as they moved further away from the city. It was a rhythmic, eternal sound, a heartbeat that didn't need a system to keep it going. It was the sound of the world as it had always been, and as it would always be, unpredictable, chaotic, and magnificently alive. Elias stopped for a moment and looked back at the city one last time. It looked small now, a cluster of toys on the edge of a vast, indifferent landscape. He felt no anger, no regret, only a deep, analytical peace. He understood now that the greatest flaw of the architects hadn't been their cruelty, but their lack of imagination. They had tried to build a world without mystery, forgetting that mystery is the very thing that makes life worth living. He turned away from the city and looked at Sarah. She was smiling, a genuine, unforced smile that reached her eyes. Whispered something, a word that the wind carried away before he could hear it. But he didn't need to hear it. He could feel the meaning of it in the way she looked at him, in the way she held his hand. They continued their walk, two small figures in a vast, beautiful world. The sand was warm beneath their feet, the sun was hot on their backs, and the air was full of the scent of the unknown. It was the first day of the rest of their lives, and for the first time, the future was a blank page, waiting for the first word to be written. The taste of the apple lingered on Elias's tongue, a sweet, lingering reminder of the physical world. He felt the muscles in his legs working, the air moving in and out of his lungs, the sun warming his skin. He was here. He was now. And that was enough. The community of destiny was over. The journey of the human spirit had begun again. And this time, there were no maps, no guides, and no end in sight. Just the road, the sea, and the infinite possibility of a single, unscripted step. The silence of the dunes was profound, a deep, resonant quiet that allowed Elias to hear the sound of his own thoughts. They were no longer the frantic, data-driven calculations of a man trying to solve the world. They were the quiet, observant thoughts of a man who was finally learning to see it. He saw the way the light caught the edge of a blade of grass, turning it into a sliver of emerald. He saw the way the wind moved the sand in patterns that were complex, beautiful, and utterly random. He saw the way the world didn't need to be managed to be perfect. He felt a deep, somatic sense of belonging, a connection to the earth that was more profound than any network. It was a feeling of being a part of something larger, something that couldn't be quantified or controlled. It was the feeling of being home. As they disappeared over the crest of a dune, the city behind them faded into a blur of heat and distance. The old world was gone, and the new world was waiting. It was a world of risk, of pain, and of uncertainty. But it was also a world of wonder, of beauty, and of truth. And as the sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows on the sand, Elias and Sarah walked on, their hearts beating in time with the ancient, unyielding rhythm of the world. They were no longer the architects of a destiny. They were the authors of a life. And that, Elias realized, was the only destiny that had ever mattered.